Welcome, LilyPod listeners and LilyTube watchers, uh, to another episode of LilyPod and LilyTube. We have a really special guest, and I confess I've been trying to get her to come on this program for a long time, and she finally relented and decided to come on, and we're really grateful for it. Uh, Holly and I have been friends for what, about 7 or 8 years or something like that.
Probably, yeah.
Hard to believe it's flown by that much, but so we shared a lot of each other's mid-single journey in terms of our stories and talked a lot. And I really have a lot of respect and admiration for her. She's a great person, and she's also a therapist. So I'm going to let Cathy introduce her in terms of her professional credentials and all of that.
Holly was raised in Alabama and headed west to BYU after high school graduation. She attended Brigham Young University and graduated in marriage, family, and human development, and a minor in Spanish. At BYU, Holly met and married her first husband, and they went on to have 3 children together. After graduation, they spent time living all over the US as well as internationally as she followed his career. And then in 2015, Holly's little family moved back to Utah, and she and her husband went through a divorce. As many of you can relate, Holly experienced this heartbreaking loss as well as the challenges of single parenting, dating again as a mid-single, contemplating a new career, and beginning grad school. All of this was done while trying to begin to heal from her own trauma and heartache. Now Holly is remarried, and her current husband, Greg, have merged their 2 little families, including 6 children. Imagine the Brady Bunch. 3 girls, 3 boys, and they're currently living in Lehi, Utah. Holly is a clinical mental health counselor currently working at Therapy Utah. She specializes in trauma, betrayal trauma, sex addiction, depression, anxiety, and couples work. In her work with clients, Holly uses cognitive behavioral therapy, polyvagal therapy, EMDR, ART, as well as the Gottman method and Sue Johnson's emotional focused therapy for couples. Welcome, Holly. We're so excited to have you. You're a great resource, and this is going to be an amazing episode. I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
All right. Well, maybe do you want to just start with like the first thoughts that came to mind as you were preparing for this podcast?
Trauma well, obviously the podcast is going to be really mainly about trauma, even though it spreads into every single area of our lives. And what's interesting is that it's a topic that's so important that affects us every single day of our life. Yet if you talk to someone on the street, usually they're like, well, I don't have trauma. Or the first expression is like, well, my parents were really good, And so just kind of what made me kind of think about this is just kind of that misunderstanding of what trauma is. And it's actually not even a negative thing. It's just something that we all have. And if we can understand that, we can work with it instead of just living life with all the side effects.
So tell us how you would define it.
The easiest kind of thing, I mean, there's tons of definitions, but the easiest one is just anything that's hard on your nervous system, anything that's hard on your body. And what's interesting is that, if you think about what's hard on your body, that can come from genetics, which is called epigenetics. It can come from our environment, right? It can come from our personality. It can come from something that happened to us, right? So even 2 people experiencing, like there's examples where 2 people grew up in the same home. One can feel that trauma and get a message about themselves, and one doesn't. So it's not really exactly what the event is, but it's how your body perceived it and how your body stored the information.
Yeah, I like that. And, one thing we teach all the time, because a lot of mid-singles have a lot of trauma, and people, like you said, people think of trauma as like being in a big car accident and being traumatized about driving after that, or seeing one of your buddies get shot next to you in battle on the battlefield. And that's certainly trauma. I mean, no doubt that would leave a mark. But we also suggest to people that are in the singles realm that have been divorced or whatever, all right, if you walked into the kitchen and tried to kiss your spouse, and she turns her head to make sure that she only gets the kiss on the cheek, one time might be negligible. She's protecting her makeup or whatever, but it happens every time you try that for 15 years. All of those micro traumas add up to something very major, do they not?
They do, and they also compound how you take that, that kiss or that rejection per se is going to be based on your past experiences. So depending on your past, and actually depending on how early it was, they realize, like with your brain developing, the earlier that it happened, and this is even pre-verbal, right? The earlier that we felt that that trauma, say we were a crying infant, right? And someone turned away from us when we needed that is actually has a likelihood of affecting how you felt at 40. So we don't realize that it doesn't, and actually the earlier the trauma occurred, the more likely it is to affect us.
Right. So if you're growing up and you're used to feeling rejected, you're kind of looking for that when something happens and you're interpreting the world through that lens. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and if you look at, I'll probably reference this a lot, Bruce Perry and Oprah's book about, it's called What Happened to Me, is a great resource for that. But yeah, everything is because it's built off the premises instead of what's wrong with me. Because right, if I have all these feelings and I've felt rejected over the years, kind of turns into a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it's not what's wrong with me, it's what happened to me that I've felt these feelings over and over again.
Right. So somebody can trigger that trauma, even if they have totally pure intent and may not be meaning to hurt you or reject you or whatever.
Oh, 100%. They could even be having the purest intention, and just it's how your body perceives it. They could just
Right.
be pushing away because there was, if you go with the analogy of going to kiss your wife or girlfriend or whatever, she turns away because she hears something like on the stove or something, that could be the purest intention, right? I don't want to catch the house on fire, but because I felt that rejection, that it's not just that time that I felt rejection, it brings up all those old wounds, is how trauma works.
Right.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
And it's cumulative.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and this is why you're passionate about
Yes.
working with trauma and helping to heal it.
I love it. Yes.
Okay.
It's so under talked about.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you another question. Well, Cathy, do you have anything more on that?
Well, I love your definition. Anything hard on your nervous system. And you mentioned genetics, and I know I have recently been diagnosed with essential tremor. And my hands have been doing this thing since I was a teenager, and it has gotten worse over time. And I never saw a neurologist or gotten a diagnosis. I just dealt with it. But that is my nervous system. It literally is. And, depending on what I eat, like I know certain things that make it worse, certain things that make it better. And I never thought of that being trauma on my body, but it really is. Like, it makes total sense to me. And so your definition kind of brought a new idea to my mind that, okay, well, that's genetic. And that part I have to manage.
Yeah, it just gave me the chills, you saying that. I mean, think about that. We are passed down so many things. Height is passed down, right? So a lot of these feelings, these even say, like you said, we're also predisposed, right? I could be predisposed to anxiety, predisposed to depression, but then a triggering event can, I could, predispose means I could or could not have it. I just have a more likely chance, right? That triggering event could trigger me into that depression or into that anxiety where maybe that wouldn't have happened, right? So it could be an option. But yeah, epigenetics, I mean, genealogy, right? It's really, I think it's just a new field, so it's not quite developed fully. And I think we'll learn a lot in the next 50 years, but there's definitely a lot of work being done on that.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah,
sense. And
really
then
interesting.
also environment, like we can each be exposed to an environment where one person is affected one way and the other person is affected a totally different way. And a lot of that's happening in our brain, and what thoughts were offered and which ones we choose to accept, and those, and then so because our brain is offered a lot of thoughts.
Yes, but it goes deeper. And that's where kind of that misunderstanding is that it's not really about the thoughts. And that's what we kind of used to think, okay, if I just change my thoughts, it's how your body perceived it. You could know that it was safe in your mind, but your
What is
body,
the difference? Because I always think of perception and thoughts as similar or the same even.
well, and we'll get into that science actually as we go along. It's just stored in different parts of your body.
Yeah.
So kind of your perception, I can see where perception could be both, but kind of facts are very different than feelings, right? So your body can know something, like you could walk into a room and know that you're safe, right? Like say I'm going to like a church activity, I could know that I'm not going to get shot. I could know that I'm not going to get things thrown at me, but my body can go into a full panic because my body feels panicked, even if my thoughts are, I can do this. This is great. Your body, when they look at if you could imagine, this is one of my favorite parts. Imagine like four currents running up from your nervous system that says you're not safe. You're not safe. People aren't going to talk to you. People aren't going to like you. You're not pretty enough. All those are running, but then your mind is sending two circuits down. So the two, if we say water, two channels of water running up, four running down, four running up. Those four running up are going to be stronger than that. I've got this. It's like we walk into a room and then we freeze because our body says, this is scary. You could get rejected. So
is what's running up like your feelings and your responses?
well, it's your nervous system reaction.
Okay.
And that's kind of what we'll get into what that looks like, but it could be my nervous system is going into overdrive in that moment to protect me. It's actually a good thing. We think of it as like annoying because it is annoying, but it's actually just trying to protect us. It's saying, hey, like say someone named Carolyn, hey, Carolyn, you've been rejected before and that was really hard on you. And so I don't want you to feel rejected again. So I'm going to move you into I'm going to prepare you for this, to run away from the singles activity, to
Say I'm fine on my own.
yes, right. I'm gonna shut off and not talk to anyone because I don't want to feel rejected. So it's kind of
how is that helpful?
how
It's
well
not, right?
it's trying to protect you. We think about it as a negative thing, but if we can have compassion for ourselves and say, wow, thank you, body. Thank you for trying to protect me. I really appreciate it. We can calm down our nervous system in those moments and we can recognize it and do things to kind of come out of it. And it could be trying to tell us something too.
Oh, sorry. So recognizing your own trauma response allows you to deal with it better. And that's something we teach all the time too. I mean, there's an example that comes to mind. Cathy had some trauma about money in a different relationship, maybe more than one. Anyway, she and I were doing some work one Saturday morning on our finances, and I was told in an email or something that I needed to change my password at the bank, and I was going about that. And in the meantime, she was trying to log into the accounts and couldn't get in because I had changed the password. And so
Triggered.
immediately she's in tears and she's crying. And I came upstairs and I said, hey, what's the matter? And she told me, and I said, look, I was going to give you the password as soon as I came up here. I'm not trying to hide anything. And she knew this. I mean, she knew that I had been trustworthy in that regard. Mm-hmm. And her brain was saying, this is ridiculous. I'm just reacting to trauma, but her body was still triggered.
But I like what you're saying about like that in between, the in between, okay, my body's trying to protect me, that recognition, and in between that and saying, okay, I think I can let this go, you're saying, okay, I'm going to have compassion on myself. I'm going to recognize what's happening. Is that right?
And there's one more step. That's perfect. A perfect example. Viktor Frankl, who's often quoted, he says, in between
Right.
stimuli and response is, I'm slaughter it, but in between stimuli and response is where true freedom lies, right?
Right, that's where your agency is.
Yeah, and I would add to that, if your body is getting triggered, your body's actually telling you, like Cathy, if every time this money issue comes up, right? And we all have these, I would say we're all going to have a plethora of these. So if I notice an issue is coming up frequently, my mind says, hey, he's safe, this is fine, but my body keeps getting triggered by it. That's also a sign to your body of, hey, there's something unfinished there that would be helpful to do trauma work on, because
Right.
your body's having a response that doesn't quite add up to the situation.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. So the protection, so the next step is I'm not only going to have compassion and accept that my body's trying to protect me. I'm going to recognize that if it's coming up, I always say if it's coming up as a trigger, it's ready to be healed. So that's when you get in and you do the work and you heal it.
Yes, it's a simple way, and that's probably going to be it most of the time. A simple way, and I know we're kind of jumping around and I'm okay with that, but if you think about trigger, it's a change in body state. I like to refer to it as a negative thing. I mean, technically it could be a positive change. But if we refer to it in this today, as a negative thing, when your body's triggered, it's usually telling you one of two things. And usually it's a combination of both. It's usually telling either there's a current boundary that needs to be set, or there's past residue, past experiences that are affecting how you think. And so it could be, it's pretty easy to kind of look it through and say, okay, maybe if you take the finances, maybe the boundary is I want to make sure I'm on the accounts, right? Which you probably already were, but that might be like a boundary is, hey,
Yeah, she was.
yeah. So there could be a boundary in that place. It's probably more of a trigger of a past, but it's one of those two things, and usually both of those.
Yeah. I want to ask you something about rejection. You mentioned that a few minutes ago, because I've seen some of these. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them that I've looked at. These studies of the functional MRIs that show that people who have recently been through an unwanted divorce, their brains light up in the same places as people in physical pain.
Mhm.
And I didn't know that research when I was going through my divorce, but I literally woke up every day feeling like I'd been kicked in the stomach, and I carried that pain around all day, and I took it to bed every night, and it was relentless for several years, like 4 years. And when I read that research, it made a lot of sense to me that it was an actual physical pain and not not a depressed state or whatever it is. The research, I think, also shows that that isn't true for other emotions. I have to believe, I guess, that in primitive times, if your tribe kicked you out, you were probably going to die. When you're a baby, you survived because somebody loved you. And so rejection really hurts. I mean, not just, it is pain that is trying to warn you of a dangerous situation. So could you speak to that a little bit, and what people can do to deal with the small rejections they receive dating and asking people for dates and trying to move forward in relationships, as well as the big rejections like a divorce?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got it right on the primitive part. That's where our nervous systems were created to keep us safe. They were created to keep us in tribes. They were created, and not to sound sexist, but they were created in that time for the men to go out and hunt. And that's why men kind of get stuck in one box sometimes, and women can move around a lot more. Anything that is going to affect or break or disrupt our primary attachment, our body is going to see it as, or even attachment in general, but even more so our primary attachment is going to see it as a survival, siren, right? It's going to send radars all over our body, and our body can't distinguish between, a perceived threat and a real threat. It cycles it through the same. So, in primitive time, it might be that I was getting kicked out. In today's time, it might be that I didn't get invited to the party.
Right.
In our bodies, sometimes depending on
And that feels the same in a lot of ways.
It can feel the same.
Voted off the island, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't mean that it's equal level, not like, like we can understand that it's different, but our bodies sometimes, if that's been a thing that we felt before, our bodies will take it the same.
Okay. Awesome. That's really good to know where it comes from initially in time in the world. And then you also mentioned that the earlier on you experience trauma, the more it affects you long term, which makes parents, I think, terrified of damaging their children. I mean, so maybe speak to that for just a minute, because especially as single parents, we think, okay, we're traumatizing our children with the divorce. They're going to be ruined for life. I mean, I felt a lot of peace because I found a scripture that just spoke to my heart, and I wrote about it in intentional courtship in the women's chapter. And it gave me a lot of peace that my children would be okay. But I know a lot of people that really stress about that. So like, how do we, I don't know, how would you advise parents to, step into the role of caring for their children in a way that helps them, decrease as much trauma as possible, but knowing they can't, necessarily shield them from everything. Like, I don't know. It's a hard question. I know.
It's so hard, and especially it's really hard. And I want to empathize with those of us that have kids that are a little bit older, like teenagers. It's kind of saying, okay, if these years were so important, you're telling me thanks, Holly, thanks for this information, that the first 6 months, the first 3 years of life are so crucial. My child's 16, disheartening, right? It's like, I feel that. I think when I was trying to, when I was having kids, the Baby Wise book was out, which talked about leaving your kids to cry. Now with the knowledge that I have, and like they learn to just cry. No, they learn to shut down their need for human attachment. So, I mean, I feel just as much guilt as anyone else for things that I know now that I wish I would have known. So it's kind of, we can learn about that. And there's some great, I can attach the book. There's a great book for those that are still in that baby rearing years that can do that. For those of us that have kind of older kids now, I say this, and I say this in the kindest way. Every child's going to have trauma. That's where we get into it's called you hear stereotypically the little T and big T trauma. Big T might be, like you said, those wounds, and little T might just be scratches on your arm, but you get them so many times that they hurt. And so that little T trauma, everyone is going to have. The best parents are still going to have kids because we're humans and we experience loss and we experience pain, and we're not in a perfect world right now.
So sometimes I tell my children, like, you came to me so I could mess you up in just the right way. Yeah. I don't mean to be like flippant about it, but I think you're right. I think we have to accept that all our kids are going to get a little screwed up, and there's nothing we can do to prevent it other than do the best we can.
I used to tell my kids, look, I know you're both going to need therapy because of me. And it's probably true.
And the idea that you even say that, think about that. If you would have gone back maybe 50 years, the fact that you even said, maybe you guys will need therapy, that wasn't an option 50 years ago. We say, oh, the crazy people need therapy, right? The fact that our kids can even get that message of, hey, there's help out there. If you're struggling, that's okay. So it's really doing the best we can. Weirdly enough, this is going to sound counterintuitive. Even if you go to the scripture, love thy neighbor as thyself, if we hate ourselves, what does that mean? We hate our neighbor, right? So really starting on working on ourselves, if we have a dysregulated nervous system, if we're reacting to trauma, if we don't feel safe in our home, safe in our bodies, our kids are probably going to mimic that a little bit. So weirdly enough, probably the best thing we can do for our kids is get healthy, then spend time with those kids, because their nervous systems will eventually, they're made to be dysregulated as kids. That's how their nervous systems are created. It's supposed to be dysregulated, but that same idea that they can regulate on the nervous system, and that eventually when they're adults, because they regulated with us, then they're going to learn how to as adults. So I would say working on yourself and allowing your kids, if you see something, get them help. If you can't do it, find someone who can.
At what age do they start to regulate?
I mean, fully never, but I mean, That's such a tough question, right? Because you've got so much neurodiversity, you've got so much, I mean, all kids are so different. You've got ADD, you've got ADHD. I don't know if I can say like they could start at any age, right? You think if you give a kid,
Do you
I
think
remember
maybe adolescence-ish, like
they could. I mean,
adulthood?
yeah, it's so different. Can they learn the skills? Yes. I remember my son coming home from second grade and he would do these little these mindfulness meditations. Like, wow, he knew there was a calm down corner in second
Okay.
grade and he could
So it's
start
like slowly over time from the time they're young.
Now,
Yeah.
I want to,
Okay, all right.
I want to ask you more about the mindfulness thing
Mhm.
because, I mean, I know I experienced rejection trauma. And the thing that the therapist I went to at that time was having me work on was mindfulness. The idea that I was feeling unsafe in a situation where I was rejected. So she was teaching me meditation and she was teaching me, touch 5 different textures in the room or whatever, so that I could ground myself and realize in the moment that I'm in, I'm safe, nothing's coming at me, there's no monster under the bed, you know. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Okay. And that is a topic that I hope that we can cover. I'll say it right now so we don't forget that left brain and right brain.
Mm.
Because that's how, if we understand how trauma is stored, that'll tell us what to do with it. So that they're not just running into a wall. Meditation can be great, but for those people that do have ADHD, for those people, actually for a lot of trauma survivors, meditation can be really triggering because you're asking them to sit still when their coping skill was moving around a lot and avoiding.
Mm.
So they kind of stay with a lot of things. Sometimes it's dipping your toe in water. I mean, like figuratively, like I may not be able to sit for 5 minutes, but maybe I can look at something for 5 minutes. I can notice a leaf, I can put my feet in. So that gives us something external to focus on. Because for a lot of trauma survivors, just sitting there with their thoughts and their body is too overwhelming.
Spinning.
Yeah, it just, and so they won't do it. They'll feel unsafe and then they'll go numb out or go into one of those fight, flight, freeze states. The grounding tools, well, why they're helpful is because when our body, and yeah, we've got our left brain and our right brain, and in the middle, we've got this thing called the corpus callosum, which is kind of nerve tissue. And when we're triggered, that left brain, which holds our logic, which holds our reasoning, which holds that accessibility to those coping skills, turns off. So the idea of grounding is if I can ground my body, just kind of like, okay, I don't want to do this, but I know, I have these exercises in front of me. If I, eat a yogurt, if I smell essential oils, if I put my feet in grass, hold an ice cube, that's another one, then I can at least get my body where my trigger level or my nervous system level comes back online, for lack of a better word, which then engages my prefrontal cortex. And those two can work together a lot better than if that goes offline, because trauma can't tell time.
Right.
And so the part on our right side, lower side, however you want to say it, it's too complex to talk about here, but on that side of the brain is where our emotions are stored. It's where fear is stored. It's where, and so you're going to be overwhelmed and you need that grounding in order to access.
In Freudian psychology, there's the id.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love grounding. I've actually discovered it recently in the health realm, and I have grounding mats on our bed, and I have grounding sandals because I don't typically just go barefoot in the grass, but like I know that's like ideal, honestly, is to get in dirt and grass with your actual bare feet. And I think what you're saying is we re-engage our reasoning mind by grounding.
100%. And we want to do both of these things. And that's why it's important. We want to not only use the calming skills to calm our body, but we don't want to spend our whole life just trying to calm. It's almost like if I have a bucket and it's overflowing, maybe I spend my whole life trying to keep it from overflowing, which is great if I've gotten good at that. That's still a heavy bucket to carry around. So not only some of the therapies that we do, not only do we want to have those skills for when it flows over, we also want to take some of that stuff out. And so
Yeah.
it's exhausting if I'm trying to keep it in there. People do it all the time, but if we can take out some of it and learn the skills, then that's a much more manageable.
Yeah. If I have to meditate 5 times a day and go to the gym,
Just to handle your life.
just to handle my life, and I've been there.
Yeah.
I think you inadvertently, Holly, told me or helped me understand why I prefer guided meditation,
Yes.
because I can focus on the person's voice. I can let my brain follow what they're telling me, and I don't have to, spin and think through it. And because I can't meditate that way either.
And for people that want to try it, one of my favorite one that's pretty easy, and I even did this when I worked with teenagers, is it's just Google body scan, on
Yeah.
YouTube. And the body scan it says, focus on your head, your ears,
What are you feeling? Don't judge it, but
yeah, that's an easy one to kind of, if you want to play around with that.
Yeah, and I've always loved the picture my entire body filled with sand, and every breath you let the sand just fall out. And I feel this like overwhelming relaxation in every part of my body as I like go through. So I think I've been able to do that on my own. And I don't love meditation either, but I do like that one. So I can see why you would recommend it.
And when we get into this part, which this left brain, right brain, I want to go into for just a second sometime, but if you look at what you just said is the imagery part, you access that part that's hijacked it by imagery, by imagining the sand.
Creative.
Yeah, that's enough that you're hitting that creative side, which is where this is stored. You're not just telling yourself, this is sand, let it go down. You're imagining it, and that accesses a different part of the brain.
Well, since you brought it up again, why don't we get into the left brain, right brain thing?
Okay. So it's kind of that idea, and remember with trauma, I do want to say this, there's so many different levels of trauma. The younger it happens, the more difficult situations that people have. It's called more complex trauma. So that'll take a little bit, so we're not, there's some things you're going to need more professional help with, the more complex the trauma is and the younger that it happened. But if we look at how trauma is stored, it's basically, if I asked you, maybe I'll ask you, Cathy, what did you do maybe you do know this, on August 20th, 1980, no, how old are y'all? I gotta do later year just in case.
Can I bring up my calendar?
1996, what did you do that day?
I don't have any idea.
So if I asked you, September 11th,
Yeah, what I did
the
that
towers, do you remember where you were that day?
I do remember that day. I was in Arizona. That's where I lived at the time. I was actually experiencing a lot of anxiety after college and trying to figure out my life. I think I called it a quarter life crisis. And so when that happened, I just remember thinking, and now the world's ending. Like wow. Like
that's exactly right. And that one just came to mind, but there's all these little events that your body remembers. Your body didn't need that other date. So it just put it in its long-term memory and stored it because it didn't need it. But we remember the day that we found out we were getting divorced, the day, all these things that happened. I can remember certain dances that I went to that were, that were hard or whatever it is, right? I remember very specific things, and we have those memories. The date probably we have them through our senses: sight, smell, taste, touch too as well. Our smell is the strongest one. So think about that. If you take, I won't get super, but if you look at I'm going to say left brain, right brain, but this is kind of going down. So it's too hard to kind of explain in one thing. But if we look at a left brain, this is where when trauma's stored, instead of getting stored in that regular spot, it's almost like it gets stuck in the mid process of a stress cycle. So it's almost stuck in an open place, like right here, maybe an open wound. And that open wound just stays there, and it's kind of just, it can't tell time. So whenever it needs it to be activated, it'll come up. It's just waiting.
The triggering event.
Yeah, and it's telling us it's not safe. Even if we go back and we say, everything turned out great, that car accident, no one was hurt, everything was fine. Our body got stuck in that overwhelming moment where maybe it remembers the windshield coming. Maybe it remembers even, I'll bring this stuff up, even sexual trauma. Sometimes people don't notice it till they're getting married, till they feel a touch, till they feel
Mm.
smell. Anything can trigger it at that moment. And when it comes up, it brings, when it comes up, the left side of the brain, which is it controls our speech, it controls math skills, it's reading, writing, processing sequences, analysis. It tells us, okay, what we need, our logic thinking, right? That right side of the brain is kind of our intuition, creativity, emotions. Emotions, they've kind of done some science. It kind of hits both, but fear and anxiety are on that right side. And so if you think about it, our left side turns off during the trigger, and our right side is just running off that fear. That trigger, because the right side can't tell time. That's a sequence, that's an order. And so the right brain just says, I've got to get out of here. Maybe I'm getting into a car that looked like the car, or I've had people see people that looked like someone that hurt them. Your body just stops, and your body, that unfinished stress cycle comes up in real time. And so what that gets to is when we're trying to treat it, we also need to use right brain things, or we're just recycling the trauma.
So
Okay, you
using-
need, like, are you saying we need a balance of both acting together, or?
We do need a balance of both, but we for sure need to include the right brain in that. A lot of things that we do, we think, okay, if I just
Think my way out of it?
if I just accept that it happened, that's great, but it only goes for so long, and then our trigger starts to come out. Like I can feel it right now, like my body's just even talking about trauma.
Mhm.
It maybe hides it for a little bit, but it doesn't finish the stress cycle.
No.
Okay, gotcha. That's why it's important to process our emotions rather than stuff them.
And processing can look really different. So we'll get into how you process, but that can look really different. Maybe just saying, if you've ever had someone tell a story and they're talking about something like really traumatic and they're just talking about it and giving you the facts, no facial expression, they're kind of accessing that left part of the brain where they can talk about what happened, but they're not in touch with both sides usually.
I've had this explained to me before as we kind of have two modalities in the way we think. One is the very ordered, kind of structured way of organizing our thoughts, and the other being chaotic, free flowing. And the person who explained this to me was also a therapist, but she said, we really ought to be living in the chaotic, free flowing side, 70% of the time or something. She said, I'm trying to remember how she put it, but she said, that's where most problem solving occurs. That's where most emotional problems are dealt with. That's where creativity comes from. And, that you need a certain amount of the other side of your brain to execute what you figure out. But I don't know. Tell me how that idea lands with you.
I think it's right. I would challenge the word chaotic. I would just say creative. I would say when they look at it, that's where music, that's where art, that's where intuition comes in. So some people it might feel unsafe to them. If you get someone that's really like, they're very averse to feeling their feelings, they'll stay in that logic side the whole session because they don't want to go over and feel and think about and create. So
we've noticed that with our coaching clients, and we know it because we've done it ourselves.
My therapist noticed it with me, and she said,
both done it.
You hide behind your intellect. You use it. You use it to avoid feeling your feelings. And I've been there. Yeah, I've done that.
Yeah, so all that side, it's not a bad side. It's actually a really healthy side. And if we can use it to access and pull out that trauma to finish those stress cycles, that's
the left side, you mean?
Yeah. I mean, the right side is where the creative side is.
Right. And you're saying because the right side is where the trauma lives, that has to be part of the process.
Yes. And
oh my gosh, that is so
otherwise
helpful.
you're just papering over it, right?
Yes, I know it's oversimplified. So someone listening to be like, well, is it really stored on the right side? But that's how we access it, for lack of a better word. And if I could drop another little thing that'll make sense to you guys, when we're accessing it, if you said that left and right brain, that's what EMDR does. That's what sleeping when we're processed. We're combining those two parts. Where my logic brain says, hey, the car accident's over. You don't have it anymore. And then your body over here is saying, um, let me feel, instead of just know it's over, let me feel that it's over and complete the stress cycle. So then my body knows it's over, combined with I feel it's better. And that's the bilateral. Each time we're doing that bilateral, it's emphasizing getting deeper in our body.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Know it's over, feel it's over. I love that. Oh my gosh, that's so great. And I actually want to go back, and I don't mean to digress, but I think this was a super important point that we didn't comment on yet. I think what you were ultimately saying with when it comes to our children or anybody else we have stewardship over, that the best thing we can do for them is to work on ourselves and model healthy.
Yes. And connection.
Because you're going to create the environment that they live and breathe in. I want to ask another question about kind of related to that. So I believe that children sometimes figure out stories, make up stories to explain abusive or unhealthy behavior by their parents because they need to love their parents. Yeah, it's a survival thing. They need to love and connect with their parents. And so, they'll explain some really awful things in a way that's positive. And then some of them even perpetuate those things on with their own kids because they needed to believe in their parents and to trust them and all of that at a very young age. And I think maybe that's a place where it's really difficult to shift the mindset and the way we think about how we're showing up in the world. But maybe you could speak to that. Am I all wet, or is that roughly correct?
No, I think it's great. I think if you think about it, I mean, we all, as we talked about at the beginning, the baby needs to be, when they've done like the studies with the orphanages, right? Like Romania, where the kids didn't get, they didn't get that touch. They didn't get that connection. We fail to thrive. We fail to
Right.
grow. We fail to, if we don't feel safe, and this is kind of something we'll touch on, kind of both of what you're saying. When we don't feel safe, our actually learning shuts down because we're more in just a survival brain. So that, even if we combine, we can't learn. It's like trying to talk to someone who's if you've ever tried to talk to someone who's screaming and say, take a deep breath, let's just talk about it. They can't hear you. And kids are the same way.
They're in fight or flight.
Yeah. So the first thing is that if we can create that safety in our bodies, and even with our kids, if we can kind of create that, that safety, that will help. Jeff, remind me of your question again. I know I kind of touched on the other subject real quick.
What was my question, Cathy?
I don't know. I had something else somewhere else I was going with it, but I do like that what you said is that safety equals learning, and that I think that's essentially what you're saying, and that our learning shuts down when we don't feel safe.
Well,
It doesn't
I
need to learn, but it has to be there in order for learning to take place.
the question I asked was along the lines of when a child needs to be able to trust their parents and believe in them, and so they make what their parents do okay. They find a story to explain it and say why it was the best way, and that it's a survival thing.
Yes.
But it can perpetuate a way of thinking and way of being that is destructive. And I think about the kids in the orphanages that you mentioned. Okay, if I'm that kid who's never held, who's never cuddled, I might make up the story in my mind that, you know what, it doesn't really matter. Hugging and cuddling and human touch isn't really that important to me. And that's just kind of how I am. And so, nobody touch me.
Yeah. And
sort of to cope.
Furthermore, in your body makes up that story. So say your mind actually still does. I know I keep separating those two, but they're kind of, say your cognitive part, that's probably a better way to say it. The cognitive part of your brain says, hey, I want to be in a relationship. I've seen these relationships. I want to be in one. Then they go and they get that closeness and they don't like it and it doesn't feel safe because as a child, it didn't feel safe. So they'll push their partner away. They'll create drama. They'll create resentment. They'll somehow, because it doesn't feel safe, they'll push it away. And if we look at why a child does it, it's very different than why an adult does it. I mean, a child has to survive, right? And children are very egocentric. Everything's about them. They're like, look, mom, I saved the world, right? I jumped off the couch. But they also take on blame. Everything's about them. And so what they learn maybe is it could be a subtle message. If we rate it on the scale from like drastic to subtle, the drastic would be, I can't get my needs met by other people. No one will be there for me. If we take a more subtle, is no one has time for me. No one wants to hear what I have to say. And so we take that, and as an adult, we usually will have one or two reactions from it. One is no one heard me as a child, so I'm going to get louder as an adult. I'm going to make sure my needs, I'm going to be overly like, I'm going to be so verbal, or I need you to meet my needs, right? It's the pendulum, right? I need that codependence. I need you to meet my needs. My needs weren't met as a child. So I need you to meet all of my needs. Or we go back to the other side where I don't need anyone. And kind of those two extreme behaviors are kind of like what you could see out of that, or possibilities.
And that's what we see a lot in the singles community is I need a relationship and therefore I must have one. And therefore I'm going to jump back into one. And then it doesn't work out because
even if it's not healthy, right?
Yep. And then, or I'm never dating again. I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
And that it really is what Love in Later Years is all about, is figuring out how to bring love back into our lives. And this is one of the things I wanted to.
In a healthy way, not in a needy way.
Well, yeah. And our whole podcast started with a series of podcasts. The first was God is Love, So Are We. And that's episode 2. And then we went on to relationship priority based on the 2 great commandments. And you brought up one of them, which is to love our neighbor as ourselves. And in order to love our neighbors, we do need to develop that love that God, see, the way I see it is God is love and we're created in his image. And so we have love in us and it's something that we can access, but that's all this trauma gets in the way. Yes. So that love then, when we can rediscover it and grow it in ourselves, then we can cultivate love for our God and for ourselves and for our neighbor. And that's the series of podcasts we did. There's like 5 of them, and I think it's 2 through 6 or something. So if anybody hasn't listened to those, I'd encourage you to do that, because that is really, in essence, at least the spiritual foundation of what you're talking about. In that you work on yourself, you model healthy, you model the ability to connect because you are now in a place you can feel safe to do so. And I think it was good for you to clarify that safety needs to be there for learning to take place, which means safety is required for learning. And that kind of takes me back to so many people who are just divorced don't feel safe. They do not feel safe. And there's no learning that can even happen until we feel safe.
They get
so this
stuck.
is where what you're doing comes in really helpful, whether it be in EMDR or art. And maybe you could explain the difference between those 2 things. Or like we have another practitioner that showed us how to do EFT, which is like a self practice of, and kind of full body, like, getting emotion out of us. So anyway, tell us a little bit more about your modalities, because if we can help people feel safe, then they can learn what they need to learn and be able to move into more healthy patterns.
Yeah, you just nailed it. You said so much. I should have written everything down. So think about that. If I don't feel safe, then, it goes back to everything. If I don't feel safe in my body, then when I wrote down, I'll just do them from my head. I haven't used any of my notes. When you look at the effects of trauma, it can be dysregulation, anxiety, depression, addiction, lost a sense of self, no trust in self. I could go on and on. So if you think about it, if I don't have that inner peace or that sense of self, it's going to be really hard to get into a relationship, and it's going to be hard to be there for my child. I know that sounds weird, but and we're all gonna have moments that the funny thing is we think, okay, I just got to get rid of this dysregulation. We're never going to get rid of it. The idea isn't to get rid of it. The idea is to be able to move in and out of it in a safe way and come back. We call it why my mind just went blank, the window of tolerance. That's kind of it's a place in the middle that feels good. We're supposed to move out of it, but you can Google window of tolerance and you'll find it. We move back in it. And so if we can be in that safe place, then we can be in a relationship a little bit easier. We can be there for our children because we can handle their distress and model positive coping skills. If we are traumatized in that moment, because spend a day with your kids and you will get triggered. If they're so overwhelming, then we can't be there for them. And we can't, it's really hard to see the truth in a relationship because for lack of a better word, we're flooding either in a relationship or with a kid. So it's really hard to have that connection. If I'm flooding and drowning, connection doesn't take place.
Well, an addiction
because you're in fight or flight, right?
Yes.
Well, an addiction numbs us out, so then we can't see truth, like because we're actually trying to not see and not deal.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes addiction can go in the other things too. Of I'm just like I'm hyperly accessing my addiction. Either way, if you look at it, I mean, I can share it if you want, but either way, it kind of turns into even fight. If we do fight and flight are up above, that's hyper arousal. My body's overly working. That's where I'm going to feel agitated. I'm going to feel annoyed. I have them right in front of me. I can feel anxiety, worry, panic, rage, or I can go down to that sympathetic or that dorsal vagal, which is the freeze. If we're in either of those states, we can't feel joy. We can't feel, we are numb from the pain.
Is that the freeze and fawn?
There's flight, fight, freeze, and fawn.
Yeah. So is the freeze and fawn in the similar category as well, or?
Fawn's a little bit different one. I think it could kind of go into, I think fawn would kind of be more a hyper arousal because I'm trying to get my needs met. Say someone came into the tribe, if we go back to these tribes, say someone came into the tribe and they were going to kill anyone who was loud, then we might try to please them. We might try to be quiet. We might fawn after them. Say I walk into a social situation and I know there's someone that I don't feel safe with or that's really loud or that, I don't know what Uncle Mike's going to say, so I'm not going to tell him anything. So I'm just going to be really nice. I might be cordial. But that doesn't mean I feel safe.
So you're going to either please.
Means you're playing somebody.
You're going to please to fawn, or you're going to be like in anger to fight, or you're going to run with the flight.
Yes. And then freeze is kind of that dissociation, hopelessness, shut down, trapped, shame, shut out. And that's kind of, they used to think it came in order, but it doesn't always come in order. Freeze can come in just as quick as anything else. And we don't have to grade them. They're just things that our body, if we really look at it, our body is trying to protect us. It says, hey, this uncle's not safe. I need you to fawn so that you can get out. The problem is our body has a hard time because of this residue that we have from past trauma. Our body has a hard time distinguishing what is a real threat and was an actual threat.
Yeah.
The woman whose husband, has betrayed her, she might see every date as a threat. And that doesn't mean they are, but her body's telling her, oh, no, don't go there. Don't do it. And so she's not going on that date because her body feels it goes and maybe it doesn't show up. Maybe it just doesn't answer the call. Maybe it just goes to sleep and just says, I'm not even going to go there. I'm not even going to go. And so our bodies go in that state, but they're really trying to help us. They're saying, hey, I don't want you to get hurt. I don't want you to go through that again.
Yeah. So would you say that the freeze is hypo arousal? The opposite of the hyper, or?
I don't know. I kind of, which one, the freeze or the fawn?
Freeze.
Freeze is hypo, shut down.
Yeah. And then the other three are more hyper. Yeah.
Yes.
The other, we've seen a lot of women in particular who take the position on the issue you brought up as an example of, hey, when I only date one person at a time, and literally the way they're applying this is after one date, if I see you dating someone else or hear about it, even if there's been no talk of being exclusive, you're a cheater and I don't want anything to do with you. And I think that's kind of a manifestation of, look, I was done wrong before, and I'm not gonna put up with it ever again, and stay the hell away from me.
Yeah, we go into detective mode. It's kind of like if
Right.
I'm going to be, say if we do the car wreck and we turn it into that, because I've been in a car wreck, I'm going to drive hyper vigilant, kind of detective. I'm going to look for any signs that you're not paying attention to me. I'm going to look for any signs that you didn't call me back. I'm going to look for anything that I can see that's going to push me away from you, because I want to see it. But the problem is with the trauma, it makes it, if I'm hyper
It's
vigilant
distorting.
around, if I'm looking at every single thing and I'm jumping, chances are I'm going to miss what's really out there. I'm going to miss
Right.
anything that's real that I need to see. If I can get rid of that gunk and be at a calm place, I'm actually going to be in a much better place to see those red flags. I'm going to be in a much, if I'm driving and I can drive calmly and drive down that road of dating, then I can look out and say, hey, this is a red flag. Let me look into it. I don't have to run away, but let me look into it. And I can trust myself.
We
And
tell,
you're going to notice it.
we teach people all the time, don't make major relationship decisions when you're triggered, because you're right. I mean, that's what we've seen too, that if you're making decisions while you're in fight or flight or freeze, you're making a decision based on fear. And chances are, like you said, 90% of the red flags you're seeing are not real. And so if you get to a place of peace, we like the word shalom. The Hebrew word for peace really means more than that. It means wholeness and restoration as well. So, but if you're in a shalom state, you see things a lot more clearly than if you're, darkened with fear. And
You may have the same, I call it kind of the difference between a reaction and a response. I'm reacting to something, which is kind of putting the control out there of someone else. I'm just reacting without letting my body process it, without thinking about it. Where that's meant for like a car hijacking or getting away from something, where if I have a response, I'm kind of weighing my options. I'm thinking about it. I really think about my values. I bring in values a lot, work a lot to boundaries. If I know my values, then I say, hey, rudeness, maybe I notice that he's rude. Rudeness isn't one of my values, so I can respond to the situation by pulling back, not just running away right first thing.
yeah, you may come to the same conclusion ultimately. I did like what Bill Clinton used to say: when you make a decision when you're mad, 80% of the time you're going to be wrong. And
Yeah.
I think it's funny because most of the people who voted for him the first time voted for him because they were mad. But but be that as it may, this isn't about Bill Clinton. I do think when you're disrupted, you tend to make poorer decisions. You tend to see things that aren't there. And you're,
We always ask everyone to just hold off on that, making decisions when they're flooded emotionally.
because your body's going to tell you you've got to get out of this relationship now or something like that. And 99.5% of the time, that's not going to be true. You will always be able to sleep on it, to come back later and think it through.
Well, and then if leaving is still the answer, you feel a lot more peace about it.
Yes, and think about if leaving was just even the only one, think about getting into fight. I'm going to attack. Maybe I'm going to, even if I'm not attacking to their face, maybe I'm verbally going through the attack in my mind. Oh, this is such a jerk. I'm creating all that energy and going into that fight stage when I may not even know the truth. Like when we get into couples work, that's exactly what we're doing with emotion focused therapy, is that usually one couple thinks, they think, we call it pursuer and withdrawer. And I know I still need to get into the
My
trauma.
first marriage was that.
Yeah. So we get into it and we think that we're right. I know my husband. I know he doesn't care about me. When we really get down to the deep part, it's usually not. It's not that you're bad, good guy, bad guy. It's that we're just misunderstanding each other. And this
Right.
is not
We're over interpreting the signals we're getting, and
exactly.
in the
And getting
pursuer,
more polarized while you're at it.
Well, and like the kiss, if I turned my head, see, I knew she didn't want me. I knew she didn't care about me. I knew she told me she wanted me to be more affectionate, but then I try and she doesn't even give me the chance. Nothing I do is good enough. And we start saying this and feeling this in our body. And it's a misinterpretation.
and I think with the pursuer distancer polarity, it even is exaggerated, because the more I withdraw or the more I pursue, the more she withdraws, the more she withdraws, the more I pursue. And it looks like to both people, she doesn't want anything to do with him. And he, all he wants is to control and overwhelm her. And neither of those is really true. They're just both, well, one's in fight mode and the other's in flight mode or something.
Both are just trying to get their needs met. That's where that
Right.
compassion comes in. They're both same with us when we do these things. Same with our kids, really. If you can look at it as this person is just trying, especially kids, they're just trying to get their needs met. I can see why they're dysregulated. Let me take them on a walk. Let me,
Give them
whatever
3 hours
it is.
of space if they need that.
Yeah, whatever it is. And
I had an EMDR therapist tell me that walking is bilateral stimulation.
it is. And that's where, if are you open if we get into kind of the
Yeah.
different types of
I would
therapy?
love to. Yeah, that's when I wanted to go next anyway.
Awesome.
So can you tell us a little more about emotion focus while we're on that, and then we'll move on?
Yeah, I love it. I mean, the two strongest ones, because if you think it like couples research, it's just been people with a PhD writing a book. And so it's like men are from Mars, women are from Venus or whatever. These are just ideas. So we really like, in the past 40 years, we get to see the research actually coming in and people actually studying these things. And the number one who I actually got to train under them directly, which was really cool, were the Gottmans, right?
We love the
Oh
Gottmans.
my gosh, that's so awesome.
And so I got to like be right beside him, ask him a question. That's probably the extent of our relationship. But just they were able to really do the research. And so I love Gottman and I love his ideas and I love his research. So I'm not undermining that. The other one, just to kind of offer a second one, is Sue Johnson's work on emotion focused couples therapy that really it brings an attachment. And if we really go back to any trauma wound, most trauma wounds are a lack of safety or a lack of attachment, which this combined, right? So it just basically says, hey, you're not the problem. I'm not the problem. It's what we create together. It's not saying one person's behavior is more acceptable. Like maybe the stonewalling might be socially more acceptable than the person who cusses their spouse out, right? But we're just saying you're both trying to make your needs met. You're doing this. I'm doing this. Let's notice our negative cycle and let's try to break it. And it's
Right. How can we deliberately disrupt it?
Yeah. And it's 70% effective, which is really high for couples therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love what you're saying.
So disrupt the pattern,
The negative
how
cycle.
we're getting our needs met in a negative way.
Yes.
So if you realize you're distancing or you realize you're pursuing too hard, you got to figure out how to back off or, whatever to disrupt the cycle where you're both pulling in opposite directions.
And when you do back off, say you're the pursuer. It's that you get to that point where you notice your cycle. That's the first. If you look up the books, there's Hold Me Tight and there's Love Sense. Hold Me Tight walks you through pretty nicely. If you're someone that I don't want to go to a therapist, but I want to try it out, and it's more effective to do it with your partner. It's kind of hard to change the dance, but you can make a huge difference by yourself. But that whole idea, if I pull back, what am I really trying? You understanding why you're pursuing, why you're pulling back, and then you're able to kind of comfort yourself. So it's not like, see, I'm just not going to go after him. It's saying, I'm actually just want him to love me. And so by attacking him, if I can understand that that's not going to help, maybe I can come to him and I can say, I'm going to break the cycle by saying, hey, I'm getting a little bit triggered. I want to say things, but instead I just want to say that I miss you. Or I just want to say that I really want to spend some time together. Then the withdrawer doesn't feel attacked and he's able to say, oh, I can deal with that comment. I don't have to run away and hide because, again, that's not as triggering as, you never spend any time with me. That's more,
Yeah. How do we normally say it? It's the
Yes.
way you never spend any time with me. I feel like you don't love me. I'm just here alone raising these kids or whatever. And whereas if you approached it the way you're talking about, kind of value neutral and this is what I would really like.
And you're right. because he's going through his head is no matter what I do is never going to be enough. I worked all day. I did the lawn. I took the kids to swimming. I did all this. No matter what I say no matter what I do is enough. So they're both right. What he's doing is enough and he's really trying. And she doesn't feel, they're both right. It's not one person or the other.
Yeah.
I think what I love about this, and I can see why it's so effective, is that going into it, it's a we. What are we creating? It doesn't matter who's more at fault, even if there is somebody more at fault. It doesn't matter, because what are we creating? And we're both right. And what are we going to do about this?
Exactly. And I hate to say this because I work a lot with betrayal trauma and I'm trying to be compassionate, but there is, after a time of like a year, or so working on the betrayal trauma, I say, I know it's not fair, but this cycle that you're getting into, of maybe like putting him a one down position or whatever, we've got to both work on it, because, and we even take the cycle outside of us. We say, this is the cycle, people name it. This is our cycle. This isn't me. This isn't you. It's actually this thing that's hurting us. And if we can address this thing, it feels less combative and less
Depersonalizes it a little bit.
Yes. Instead of you're the bad guy, I'm the good guy.
Almost like address the energy.
Yes. And this is a whole other, like we could probably spend a whole podcast just on EFT.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I've heard people who had, instead of divorcing each other, they decided to divorce the energy they were creating, which I think is really what you're getting at with this whole emotion focused couples therapy. And I think it would be good to say here, because we have a lot of people who have experienced real victimhood. I mean, like, and we always say it's not good to feel like a victim and talk like a victim and stay a victim. But people sometimes have really experienced those things that, they have every right to stay there if they want to. They have earned that right through the horrible things they've been through. It doesn't necessarily serve them, but I guess what I'm saying is there's legitimate trauma that comes from actual, real, true abuse. And then sometimes abuse is in the eye of the beholder. And I mean, it's very hard to define in a lot of ways. But I guess let's just assume they've experienced the worst of worst possible abuse situations. And what is really kind of terrible and kind of awesome at the same time is that each person is responsible for their own healing, even if it's not their fault.
However, I'm going to say however there. It does not work. Couples therapy doesn't work if there's those things. I can have a couples therapy, say a guy has an active addiction, or say there's domestic violence. We actually screen for that in our sessions, and we can't work with them. So if there's anything, I work with each couple separately.
What do you do with those couples?
I do a lot with addiction. So say there's an addiction, I'll say, guys, I know you really want this. I'm going to give you the resources, but we're not ready there. If there's an active addiction, there's a third party in right. Addiction's a tricky word, especially when you get into that, can be triggering for a lot of people, because there is a difference between looking at porn once a year. This is a whole nother topic, right? We can do another day, and doing it consistently. So if I decide, from the criteria, that there is an active addiction, that there's any domestic violence, sexual abuse, any unsafety, right? That's really like, then we say, hey, we're not ready, or any affairs, anything like that. Then we say, you're not ready for couples therapy. These are what we can do. Let's go back to individual therapy, work on our own trauma, where really, if there was that abuse, if the way you said it was kind of like the guy, then we would work on his coping skills, his healing, and actually would probably work on his trauma, right? Of why he was being abusive.
Right.
Okay. And, I forgot that we were talking about couples for a minute.
Yeah.
So taking couples out of it, but I love that you clarified that, because that's good. Because I think what you're saying, safety is required to learn, and we can't learn as couples if there's not safety. That's what you're saying, right? That's why you scream for it.
Yeah. And therapists can actually re-traumatize people that come in and say, people have been re-traumatized by bishops too, that didn't really understand, if they've said, oh, we'll just have more sex with your husband, or, oh, you're both doing things, you're getting angry and he's hitting you. That's really invalidating. And so if we see something isn't safe, then we were not supposed to touch it, right? We're supposed to.
Safety is required for learning as a couple.
Some certain level of safety, right? Doesn't have to be perfection, but, and if it's an individual, yes, it is that you have been through the trauma, and we can sit with it. I always say, like, this isn't to forgive him. This isn't to, you could carry this around, but it's heavy.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
it affects you. I mean, it affects you in so many different ways that if we can hit the trauma, then you can make different decisions, but you can make them based on, what you want, not on fear. And so we'll always hit that. I try to do trauma work with every single one of my clients, no matter why they got here.
Yeah,
Well,
that makes
Holly-
sense. Well, and actually, I want to finish up with this because I didn't quite get back to what I was trying to say.
Okay.
So, taking couples out of it now that we've clarified who you can work with and who you can't and who you shouldn't. When I'm talking about somebody who's been through that abuse, and let's say now they're divorced and they're on their own, it's always our responsibility to heal the trauma. No one else can do it for us. Even the person who perpetrated, even the person who caused it. In fact, they're probably not going to show up and do it for us. And if we wait for that, we will be waiting our whole lives and living in that trauma, like without doing anything about it because we feel like it's not our fault. It's not our fault, so it shouldn't be our problem. But it is our problem, and therefore it is our responsibility to heal it, even if it wasn't our responsibility to cause it.
Yes, and it's kind of a two-edged sword. It is our responsibility. It's kind of like if you think about healing as a cake with a frosting on top. As an individual therapist and as a trauma therapist first, I'm always like, we can do this. We can do this all on our own. But actually, the research says that we need other people and we need safe connection. So it's kind of like we lower the trauma through that individual trauma work. And then kind of the icing on the top to healing is that I can feel the relationship, the attachment is restored. It's not with the person probably who abused us, but usually when we have trauma, we pull away from everyone, even ourselves.
So the ability to attach.
Well, in the experience of attaching, that's what we're doing in couples work. And that's what we're doing think about it. When we say, go to your kid, attach. When we say, go to yourself, meditation, we're attaching, self-compassion. The ability to get back, if we can clear the trauma, there's usually, it's not that the cake is finished. People think, okay, if I can just clear the trauma, I'm good. It's about clearing the trauma, and then putting the attachment on top really does it. Can we get those primary attachments back? And they might look obviously that partner role is probably the deepest attachment, but also an attachment with God, also an attachment with our kids, our best friends. Can we learn to trust again and have healthy connection? That's where trauma is also healed. And if we can have both of those together, that's going to be, the recipe for healing is the trauma work and attachment work.
I love that. And I'll turn it back to Jeff now. Thank you.
All right. So there's a couple of questions I have here. Now, quite a while ago, you said something about, and I want to make sure I'm understanding it, that you don't ever completely clear the trauma, but you learn how to move in and out of it more efficiently. Or go ahead and first.
The triggers.
The triggers. Right.
So that's different than the trauma. Does that make sense? Oops.
Right. So when you get triggered, you see it for what it is, and you're more able to move through that and move out of it. Okay. So and if the trauma has been cleared, then would they still get triggered?
We're human. I wish I could say, no, you'd never get, say if we did it on rejection, I wish you could say, Jeff, you're never going to feel rejected again the rest of your life. You're never going to feel not good enough. But that's
still there to some degree.
Well, and think about it. If I can get it down, say it's at a 10 and I can get it down to a 2, maybe a 1 on a normal day, maybe it gets up to a 4 on a really hard day. I have all those skills in my bank now from doing all the work, from reading the books, from having friends I can call, from having therapists, coaches. I have ways to deal with it. If I'm at a 10, then I'm kind of shutting down. Yes. So it's not that the trigger with the trauma work, we are trying to clear it out in the sense, but it doesn't mean you're never going to experience those disruptions. It means that it's not going to come on you. Some people describe it like when they're describing EMDR, you still have full knowledge, but it's kind of like watching a movie. If you watch a disturbing movie, it's still disturbing and it still might bring you down a little bit. But if it's happening to you, if someone's chasing you, that's going to be much more disturbing than seeing it on a movie. And your body can handle that. Your body can handle it. You can use its prefrontal cortex to come in and say, yeah, you're just having a really bad day. I'm sure that person's having the person that rejected you. I'm sure they're having a bad day too, and we can work through that because it doesn't overwhelm us and flood us.
Right. I appreciate that clarification because I think, like you said, a lot of people are going to hear clear the trauma and it's going to be like, well, we're taking it from 10 to 0. And really, we're taking it from, 10 to 2 or something and giving you more tools to move out of it and cope with it. So I like that. The second question I had kind of related to what you've been talking about with emotion focused therapy. Now, the Gottmans have the 4 horsemen of the marriage apocalypse. And for the benefit of our listeners, those are contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling, and criticism. So my belief would be that when one of those, and incidentally, just funny aside, John Gottman says he can tell within 15 minutes of meeting with a couple if they're going to get divorced. And he says, I don't get invited out to dinner very often.
Yeah. And he can tell someone might be able to say, okay, well, that's a 50-50 chance, right? He can tell within the next 6 years if they're going to get divorced, which is crazy.
Yeah. Well, and like I said, my first marriage was we had the pursuer distancer polarity, and we had a stonewalling component to that. And he says, I heard him say once, contempt is right in your face, so they get divorced faster. Stonewalling marriages can last longer. He says maybe 15 years on the average, which is exactly how long my first marriage lasted.
And both of our second marriages had contempt, and they were like
quick
year done.
Yeah. So anyway, what I was going to ask you about these 4 horsemen, it strikes me in what you're talking about with emotion focused therapy is that in each of these 4 horsemen that presents in a couple, there's some trauma lurking behind it. Somebody may feel like they haven't ever been listened to or understood, and so they may stonewall because what's the point of talking to you? All you're going to do is criticize and hurt me or whatever. And go down the list, you could find traumas like that maybe underlying all of these. So maybe speak to that in terms of emotion focused therapy, how you would look at dealing with the 4 horsemen.
I mean, you just described it perfectly. The 4 horsemen just play into the cycle, right? Whether it's right. Contempt, if I know each time my husband does this, I start to get nasty, and start to say rude and put him down. Whether it's stonewall, I know that I walk away and I don't come back. So those play in perfectly. They're just the actions that are sometimes in the cycle. And if we can recognize them, it's not just recognizing them. I can know something, but can I know why I'm doing it? If we can get into that vulnerable place, which takes time, I can know why, like you said, maybe I'm stonewalling because I couldn't lean on anyone and I couldn't come to anyone when I was a child. So I realized I'm on my own. So I'm quick to say, well, I'll just do it myself. So I realized that when I'm stonewalling, this is what's going through my mind, my heart, my body. Then let's do some individual work on that. If I know that's a big trigger for me, and my clients who have done individual work first, our couples therapy is a lot quicker, a lot easier if they know who they are, if they've worked through some of their trauma. We can get through it pretty easily because they're more self-aware. If people haven't done that work, a little bit, no matter how they did it, it doesn't really matter if they're more self-aware. But no, your childhood does play into it, and we bring it in through emotion-focused couples therapy. So Gottman's kind of like what you're doing during it.
Right.
The why is kind of what we get to with the trauma. And then the attachment part is how can we get our needs met in a more effective way, create more, because they're saying even the withdrawer, usually it's something to the effect of, I just want to be enough, or I just want to be accepted.
Right.
And actually get their needs met by changing how they interact.
Yeah,
right.
That makes sense.
Well, and the Gottmans are treating the interaction, but there's also the causes. And so I think I would presume both of those are important, and the individual work is that underlying trauma. And
yes, and the Gottmans are great. They're great. Their method isn't quite as laid out, and so you have to be pretty high. Even though I'm trained in Gottman, you have to be pretty highly trained to kind of really use it every single session for a couple session, where EFT, it just gives you a little bit of a roadmap that's a lot quicker to understand.
Yeah.
The emotional focused.
Yes, that EFT.
Yeah. All right.
It's used a lot.
You know, you mentioned that couples heal a lot faster when they're self-aware, and it reminded me of the time we interviewed Jennifer Finlayson-Fife on our podcast, and we asked her, what is the one thing you would recommend men singles look for in a future partner? And I thought this was a brilliant answer, and that was self-awareness. Someone who really knows how to self-assess and self-regulate and self-change. And hands down, like that, I do think that is the number one thing that we would recommend to everyone looking for a companion. I mean, we kind of recommend narrowing the list down to a few things. And I would think that should be in the top 5, because if that, like you said, if they're there, couples therapy, if they need it, easy, so much easier.
And then you need to become a self-reflective kind of person too.
Of course.
Exactly. And if you have that skill, even in those trigger moments, the Gottmans say that like 70% of the fights that you fight about actually can't be solved. And couples that fight is actually healthier than couples that don't, right? So it's
Right.
not that you're not going to get in disagreements, but do you have the skills to come back? Do you have the skills to not, like, I know that when I get mad, I'm not going to bring up divorce to my husband. I'm not going to throw those words around. Like, is there enough self-awareness of your partner, of the relationship, that you don't fight as dirty, right, or as deep, but then when you do get triggered, because you've done enough work, it's easier to come back and say, well, I know I did this and I'm really sorry, and I recognize I did this, I'm going to work on this. And so it doesn't really matter what comes up, you're able to work through it a lot easier.
Oh yeah. I mean,
Well-
it's kind of like the foundation of the healthy relationship is being healthy in yourself.
110%.
Speaking of the Gottmans, we have a policy in our marriage that we both agreed to, that when either one of us is triggered or perceives that the other one is triggered, we can call time out at any moment. And because we have it in us to fight all night, we could do it. We don't do it because generally someone figures it out early enough on.
Like,
To
we're
call-
going nowhere good fast. So
Yeah.
let's just,
And then, anywhere between 20 minutes and a few hours, usually the person who called the timeout typically comes back and says, hey, let's have a prayer. Let's talk about this again. We find that we can solve stuff in 5 or 10 minutes because we're not triggered anymore.
well, and since we did
And-
EMDR individually, which was the best couples therapy I've ever experienced, it was doing that ourselves, because all of a sudden all the things that we're triggering to talk about that we couldn't talk about, not a problem. So we do a lot less timeouts than we used to, just simply because we got a lot of that trauma out of our bodies.
It seems like once every couple months now or something like that. But
Yeah, so maybe you could tell us next, because we've covered couples pretty thoroughly. EMDR and art, you do
Yes.
those two, and you like one better, and maybe you could explain the difference.
I will. And so let me just give you the overlay real quick, and then we'll kind of focus in on those two. If you think
by the
about
way, I want to talk about sexual trauma in a minute, but let's do
I
this.
don't know if we'll have time,
Need-
unfortunately. Maybe
Don't-
that's enough, another episode.
well, we could come back and talk about sexual trauma, betrayal trauma, anything related to that too. Like we could do
well,
that.
I'd like to cover it for at least a couple minutes, even if we can't
All right,
fully
Holly,
delve into
floor
it.
is yours.
Okay.
Yep. Go.
As far as if we, again, we could probably spend a whole nother session on just this part. So I'm just going to kind of put it in a nutshell, and then if we want to go into detail more later, there's all those things. There's the knowledge, the psychoeducation that's going to help you deal with trauma. There's the exercise, there's the eating healthy, there's the having friends connection, there's having a higher power, there's all these things, there's there's a lot of different things that we can do on our own to kind of work through that. And then there's those deeper things that keep coming up. It's not that we have to come, this is where it takes a little bit more, and that's where you would kind of get into the trauma therapies that we do. One is IFS, which is internal family systems, which is kind of called parts work. That's a trauma treatment. There's numerous others. I know I'm going to forget some of. There's somatic work, but they're all that right side. They're all the brain.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all the body, and they're connecting. My two favorites that I've seen that are the most touching to me actually is the EMDR, the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, which is that bilateral movement, right? I'm going back in the memory, I'm recreating it, I'm visually recreating it, and that's how the trauma is stored. I don't lose the facts. I don't know. It's not like I think, oh, this didn't happen, but my body can finish the stress cycle, and it can bring in my left brain and right brain to be on the same page where we know the stress cycle is completed. I love EMDR. If I could describe the difference, EMDR is like you're going to take a big pool. We all have our own pools. So it's nothing to be ashamed of. We have our own pool, that our own negative core beliefs, whatever they are. EMDR sections it off, and it does like one part at a time, but it does it well. But it really does it with like, I'm scrubbing with like a brush, and it does it so well. But sitting in that murky water that's in the rest of the pool gets really hard for people. And so people are like, oh my gosh, this is, maybe we only got through part of one, and so people just, in order for them to come back into that dirty pool, they're tired and they're exhausted, and their body says, who wants to go back and relive trauma? And we don't do it very long, but even take 6 months of therapy, that's long for a lot of people that have spent their whole life avoiding these feelings. So EMDR is a longer process. It's like we have to go through each section of the pool. Most people don't have to finish the pool, but if they can get through, but it takes money, it takes time, it takes sitting with that trauma, being dysregulated for the day. And so a lot of people, I've found that they love it, but they make up excuses. They'll go into their brain, they'll go into talk therapy, they'll just kind of avoid it, right? So ART is kind of like, for copyright, I'm not going to say they're connected, but it's the same idea of like a bilateral. I know they're their own entities, but it's called accelerated resolution therapy. And I love both. I'm not, I feel like EMDR is my first child, ART is my second. I love them both, but ART is just a little bit more accessible. It's almost like we go in and we clean the whole pool for maybe different issues. So maybe we have to go in a couple of times, but 1 to 5 sessions is all we need. And we go in and we clean the whole pool. And so we go in and we create those images. We go into that right side of the brain. We have your body experience the emotion, the memory, pull it out. But instead of sitting in it, session after session, we're sitting in it for probably total about 2 to 3 minutes. And we're pulling out and we're finishing the stress cycle a lot quicker. I could say maybe it's not as thorough as far as like it's not getting that deep clean, but most people don't need that. They just need it to be clean enough, and then they can use their coping skills, and they can use life, and so it just works a little bit faster.
Are they still using the EMDR techniques with the eye movement or the pulsing?
Yeah, the bilateral stimulation. Yes. So we're still using bilateral. We use the eyes, which is, we've seen it on TV, kind of those things. If those don't work, then we use tappers, or it's worked great online. I've had so much success online we just tap. We either tap or we move our eyes online. It's worked incredible. And so COVID kind of forced our community to kind of get out there and say, okay, fingers crossed, let's see if this works. It works amazing. And so for ART to work, we just need to be able to do 3 things. We need bilateral. We need to be able to see images, because that's how we process. And that's how we're going to release, kind of like what Cathy said about the sand. We release after each image, we release, go to an image, release. It's actually not very complex. And then our body releases it and we go back, and it's like, it'll start at a 10 and people are like, it's a 0. We get it all the way down. And this isn't, I like to do 90-minute sessions, but I can squeeze it into maybe 60 minutes if people have been doing it, or half it. But it's been the most, and then we need motivation. So do I have a motivation to get rid of this? Because my body knows if I say, I'm sick of carrying this around, it's too much, then that's motivation enough. It doesn't have to be. And that's where I've seen the most. I even bore my testimony on this, and I don't do that a lot, but it was probably a couple months ago. I just said, this is the most spiritual experience I've ever seen, because we're not recreating you. We're actually just taking all the gunk off. That's
freeing you.
Yes. And so your true self comes in, and most people are like, the things that they say are just mind blowing, but they're true and they're honest. They're like, I'm so, like, I don't know. I can't even put them into words, because their feelings are so, and with ART, you don't have to share that trauma. So I don't even have to know as a therapist what you can just say, I had this experience, and I don't even have to know details about it. So we don't have to voice it quite as much. We just have to imagine it in our minds.
Okay. So you kind of get to it faster
Mhm.
It's more accessible. It cleans the whole pool. It's 3 to 5 sessions. You're done.
Are you discussing?
But it's not quite as thorough. So that's where you like the EMDR if they have the time and the money and the ability to process a little bit deeper.
Yes, and the willpower. I mean, to say I'm going to do EMDR every time usually doesn't happen. So people are like, I'm going to do it, and they'll spend a year of therapy, and they might do it 4 times because I can't make them do it.
Yeah.
So it's just a little bit more, okay, let's just get what we can, and let's really let you feel a difference now.
And then you mentioned like IFS, internal family system, and somatic. What are those?
IFS is just parts work. That's the easiest way to say it. It's
What
like
is it?
parts work, like the part of you that's maybe a child, the part of you that's scared, the part of you that's defensive. They call them kind of like this, the part of you that's kind of a people pleaser or like a firefighter. They have different, I'm not trained in it, and it's actually pretty, the book is called No Bad Parts. If people want to learn more, there's people in my office trained in it. But it's a growing therapy. Over the next 10 years, you'll see some amazing, but it gets into that touch, it gets into that side, that creative side, that understanding side, that feeling side. And it says, you're good.
So it's kind of treating your whole, for lack of a better word, psychological makeup as one system, and you touch one part of it and you affect everything else. Is that right?
Well, they work together, right? So that older part, that, I mean, I hate to say a lot about it because I don't feel like I'm trained in the lingo as much as I should be if I was using it. But yeah, different parts can help out different parts, and you can accept the part. Maybe there's a part of you that is scared to date again, right? And instead of just saying that part needs to go away, we're going to welcome that and have compassion on that part and say, yeah, you are scared to date again, and that's okay. And we're going to keep you right here. And this part's going to lead and kind of go into that dating scenario.
Well, it's moving from buts to ands in some ways. Like I am this, and I can also go ahead and date. Like I've got the fear, and I'm going to go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
Because
And
everybody has the fear, pretty much. I mean, you stand down and look off the edge of the high dive, that's terrifying.
yes.
If you just stand there
and contemplate it.
And you're bringing in that part into that, out of the subconscious into the conscious, and it gets to like have a voice, and it gets to say, this is why I'm scared, and almost just saying it out loud.
Yeah,
And
fear, you're along for the ride,
yes.
But you're not in the driver's seat.
And there's things that you can do, but this part's going to help you in this area. Like this part, now that you're more aware, you're going to have more boundaries. Now you're going to have more, you have tools to use, right? So different parts can help each other out, where it doesn't just stay like a subconscious fear that has it's like, okay, we can bring it out, we can process it, and then it's going to be a little bit more free, and it has options when it's free.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then somatic, you mentioned that.
Somatic, that one's just body work, nervous system work. So if I can kind of get stuff out of my nervous system and learn to work with my nervous system, so that one's kind of growing, but it's if I can change which body state I am, then I can make different decisions. Then I can, it's kind of interesting. Most therapies incorporate it, but it is its own therapy as well.
Okay.
It's just working as the somatic, the body symptoms, the body senses.
Yeah,
Okay,
that makes
cool.
sense. Is there anything else you wanted to mention in terms of modalities? I think we've covered a lot of what, you do a lot of.
Yeah, I can't think. I feel like I'm trained in more, but my mind's going blank.
That's okay. We covered, I think, the most important. I know we wanted to cover EMDR and ART, and then the emotional focus couples therapy. I think that was all in your bio.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think if Jeff wants to maybe have the last few minutes to cover just a little bit of,
just a tiny bit of sexual trauma. And I think this is really important to a lot of our audience, because number one, Latter-day Saint mid singles many want to be celibate and try to, avoid violating the law of chastity. And then secondly, I believe that Sean Brotherson, who's a family science professor and a friend of ours, says, he used to do an article in Meridian magazine every 6 months or so about sexual problems within Latter-day Saint marriages. He said, I always braced myself for my email inbox to be jam-packed for 6 weeks of people telling me all of their problems in the bedroom. And I think we have a faith community that is so where there's such moral overtones to everything associated with that subject, we almost don't even dare say the word.
He even came up with the 4 horsemen of the sexual apocalypse.
Oh, I could see that.
Along with antidotes, which he shares at the end of his interview with us, which is called Thriving, I think, Healing and Thriving with Sean Brotherson. So if anyone wants to check that out, it's really cool, like what he came up with there.
So I wanted to ask you, number one, how do we heal from sexual trauma when we're not sexually active and having something trigger it? And then secondly, the moral overtones that we have, I think, can become a convenient way for people to avoid the sexual hangups, for lack of a better word, that they might have. I'm not going to kiss anyone until I'm really serious because I think it's wrong, or because I feel like I'm, you know, like the more restrained I am, the more righteous, and that can even spill over into marriage. So talk to me a little bit about those two things.
Well, I think that's, and that's where we kind of have to differentiate. And I'm not here to like draw that line and say which is which today, but sexual trauma,
No.
when we look at like, 1 in 3 women, and I think it's 1 in 4 boys have been sexually
Those are
traumatized.
the numbers I've heard.
And that's probably even what, I mean, who knows if there's probably, if we look at just microaggressions and other things like that, it's probably higher. But
Yeah.
if we think about that, how is that affecting us? If it is affecting you, a lot of people say, oh, well, it doesn't affect me, but if it doesn't, great, then we don't do anything. But I would challenge that if there hasn't been some way of processing, I would challenge if it's not in there affecting you in some way or the other. So obviously for any sexual trauma, that's where I would recommend, it's not that we would still want to do the exercise, the connection, all that, but I really would go in and kind of see, and you can even test your body. We even ask our bodies, when we bring it up and when we talk about it, when we feel it. Before I do a session, I'll say, well, what does that come up with your body right now? If they say 0, okay, well, maybe they're avoiding, but most people say between a 7 and a 10. If it's a 7 to 10 of something that happened 30 years ago, there's probably something there that we can at least look at. We don't have
Like, how much is it bothering me? Is that the question?
How much is it bothering me? How much do I feel it in my body? How much does it affect my life? Kind of those kind of questions. If I say, wow, this is just always with me, it's always a constant, but when I get triggered, it's like a 7 or 8. And as we talk about it, I ask them kind of what comes up in their body then.
And
if they say 0, I think they're in freeze state, but I would say start with trauma work if it is that sexual trauma. That would be different than like kind of those hangups.
And would you apply that where, let's suppose they really had a lot of problems, or it was a source of conflict in their prior marriage? Are you going to think there's a strong chance that there's some trauma involved?
You mean if they have problems in their marriage first?
Related to sex?
Not necessarily. It could be a sexual trauma, or not having just, I think, having those sexual experiences kind of, sometimes we're a little bit blind to them coming out, and so I think that can be traumatizing in and of itself, of just like, I'm not good enough, I'm not adequate, it doesn't feel good. Like there's so much that we can blame ourselves for.
This person is cold to me and doesn't love me, and go down the list of things on the other side of that equation.
Or he looks at pornography, he doesn't want, I must not be good enough. So I think that's where ART comes in a little bit stronger. EMDR,
a lot of what we make it mean, what we make our experience mean.
And sometimes we can't change that. I can think about it differently, but my body's still going to react. And so the ART can be used for any habit. It can be used for any thought. It can if we just even want to get clarity around it, like, what is my truth now around sex? Like if I go back and probably rewrite it, a lot of these couples that might say, yeah, we were both young. We were both immature. We both didn't know what we were doing. I didn't know that, sex was this way or that way. And so I can kind of free myself, forgive myself for anything that maybe like I feel like I contributed, if there's not like a major sexual, there could still be a lot of clarity had just by shedding that bad experience or that guilt or that
shame.
Exactly. And so that can be anything, any of those hangups. It's hard to tell someone though. You can't make someone want to get rid of. So if they have a hang up about not kissing, you're obviously not going to be able to change that.
No.
But if they say, hey, I want to be
They
open,
can change it if they want to, if they see it as an issue.
But it's going to be changed not by changing the behavior, but by freeing ourselves from what we're making the experience mean in our brain and our body, and forgiving ourselves and letting it go.
yes, and it's really cool because I don't even know, you or the client, we don't know what's going to come up in that. So it's usually something that's like, oh my gosh, that's so true and so right. But I never know. And I would share stories, but I'd be breaking confidentiality. So it's like you don't know what's going to come up in those things, but it's right. And it's exactly, it's really cool because you're looking to your soul, you're looking to your body, and you're saying, you know how to heal. You know what's not true and what is true. And so we're kind of going in. And maybe they're saying, you know, that expectation of I needed to be something to prove that I'm something else, right? I need to show that I'm righteous. Whatever it is that their body doesn't need, will get flushed out. It's really interesting.
So
So
like the truth comes out. Up.
yes. And it's always like a pure spiritual, it's always like a real truth that I'm like blown away each time. And so are they. And so it brings up tears, and it brings up like, I can just love myself, and this is just the way I am right now. But it's a truth. It's a shedding of something I've been carrying around. And it's a truth that's been, I don't want to even say restored, but just kind of is shining brighter now.
Yeah. Oh man, I love that. And I'm glad we took a few minutes to talk about this, but I definitely think we got out of
Yes.
Holly come back and spend a whole episode
If you'd
on
be
that.
willing, that would be so
100%. Yeah.
And Holly, I want to say one more thing, personal indulgence. I want to thank you for being such a good friend during my mid-single years.
Oh, thank you.
You know, and the conversations we shared, people can get a little flavor of it from hearing this interview. But I want to tell the folks listening, find yourself a few friends like Holly when you're going through your mid-single years, who you can listen to, who you can trust. And I totally did trust you. I mean, I think you know that.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
Who can, you know, be that support network that we need so much when
we all need wise people
going through
who
that.
love and accept us and have some wisdom to share.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
We didn't even get to the trauma of the mid-singles.
yeah.
Although I do think we covered a lot that will be
Yes.
helpful in that community.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
I'm really grateful for Holly and other people that were, you know, that were part of that support network for me. So
thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. It was great.
And I appreciate you guys giving me this opportunity. It's something that I'm so passionate about. And I love, I mean, your questions were amazing. And thank you for giving me this platform to give back to an age group, to a situation, to something that is so important, and that we can all, I think it's underestimated. It's kind of thinking, okay, well, when I get a partner, I can grow, or I'll be complete, but there's so much growth to take place. And we didn't even get to the subject of post-traumatic growth. When we've been through something, our chances of growing are even bigger. So there's so much room to grow during these times as well.
yeah, we need to have you
that
back on.
that once you heal the trauma, there's growth and there's new things to experience, which is really cool because it just opens up your world
In every area, not just sexually, not just emotionally, not just connection. Every area opens up, and it's amazing to see.
Beautiful.
So yeah, we have more than enough to fill another episode. So we need to have Holly back. But Holly Voisin, thanks again for coming on, for being a great friend. And we want to remind our audience to remember that any time is a great time for more love in your life. Thank you for listening.